I remember the sound before I remembered my own name, a tearing shriek of metal surrendering to gravity, a roar that felt like the sky itself collapsing. They told me later the plane broke apart over a ravine near the Canadian border, that 87 people died instantly. I wasn't one of them. I lived through what should have been my ending, wedged between a half-splintered row of seats and the frozen bark of a pine tree. Rescuers found me hours later, half blue, half broken, and wholly unrecognizable. They brought me into the hospital as Jane Doe. My purse had disappeared somewhere during the evacuation, my ID too. The crash had swollen my face beyond recognition. Ribs cracked like someone had dropped porcelain on concrete. A lung punctured. My body felt stitched together by machines whose rhythm wasn't mine. For the first 3 days, I floated somewhere between pain and the kind of dark that feels thick enough to drown in. I didn't know who I was yet, June. Mother, widow, giver, fool. But I learned who my daughter had become before I even remembered my own reflection. It happened on the 4th day. A nurse had left her phone on the counter. Screen up, speaker accidentally on. She was 2 floors below, collecting linens. I shouldn't have heard anything. I wasn't supposed to be awake at all, but I was, barely. And my daughter's voice, bright, relieved, traveled up through the static, like a blade designed for one person only. Mom's plane crashed. Finally, we can sell everything. A laugh followed, sharp, careless, as if a long-term inconvenience had finally resolved itself, as if I hadn't raised her, fed her, prayed for her, paid her debts, carried her tears and her triumphs through decades, as if I mattered only as long as I could be used. My eyes fixated on the ceiling tiles overhead. 23. Then again, 23. The shock made it impossible to breathe, even with the machines helping me. I thought of her at 12, running to kiss my cheek before school. I thought of planting daffodils together when she was 6. I thought of every apology I had accepted from her that didn't deserve forgiveness. And then I thought of nothing at all, just a numb hollow spreading through me where a mother's heart should have been. When the nurse returned, she didn't realize I'd heard. She didn't know I had swallowed the kind of truth that changes a spine forever. She simply carried on, calling me Miss Doe, unaware that she had just delivered me the cruelest clarity of my life. Later, they explained that a body pulled from the wreck had been misidentified as me. Outdated dental records, a charred jawbone, a clerical error, tiny cracks in a system that becomes a crevasse when no one is looking closely. Less pressure from family, one nurse said gently, meaning it as comfort. Less pressure. No frantic calls. No vigil. No daughter demanding answers. No granddaughter crying into a pillow. Just silence. It seemed the world was more prepared for my death than I was. The next morning, a man in a suit appeared, a polished corporate type, whose shoes gleamed too brightly for the scuffed linoleum beneath them. He represented the airline, he said. Settlements were being offered to victims' families and survivors. Time sensitive, he murmured, smiling the way people smile when they want your signature more than your understanding. He believed I had no family searching for me, no one verifying whether I made it out alive. And he was right. I asked him questions. My voice was sandpaper, but my mind was sharpening itself, piece by shattered piece. That was the moment the first fracture inside me hardened into resolve. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell the nurses my real name. I didn't alert Candace. Not when speaking felt like dragging barbed wire through my throat. Not when my own child's laughter at my death still echoed against my ribcage. I would remain dead, at least in their eyes. As my body fought its slow, stubborn battle back into function, I began to understand the deeper wound wasn't physical. It was the realization that I had been grieving the wrong version of my daughter for years. Somewhere along the line, the girl who once clung to me during thunderstorms had withered into someone who saw me as property, not parent. 3 weeks later, when they handed me a mirror for the first time, I barely recognized myself. A map of bruises covered my face, swollen and discolored. My hair was tangled, matted, aged by injury and shock. But my eyes, those I knew, they had seen childbirth, betrayal, bankruptcy, widowhood. They had endured. You're still here, I whispered to the stranger in the mirror. No obituary, no funeral, no daughter clutching a photo with puffy red eyes. Only a real estate listing my home described as an outdated fixer-upper, already posted online by the daughter who celebrated my disappearance. The machine beside me beeped steadily, but inside, something shifted cold and precise. Not revenge. No. Something quieter. Something steadier. Justice. I closed my eyes, letting that word sit in me like an anchor. Heavy, but grounding. I wasn't going to announce my survival. I was going to watch. I was going to see who my daughter truly was when she believed I no longer existed. And when the moment came, I would rise from the grave she had built for me, not shouting, not vengeful, but unmistakably alive. Rehab smelled like bleach, wilted carnations, and quiet resignation. The walls were painted the kind of cheerful beige meant to soften despair, but it only made the air feel heavier. They transferred me there once I could walk 8 shaky steps without collapsing. A slow miracle, the doctor called me. He didn't know that what kept me alive wasn't strength. It was a question I couldn't stop circling. How quickly will my daughter erase me? I didn't want them to see how fast I was healing. I liked being invisible. I liked slipping through the system unnoticed, the way a ghost might glide through a house she no longer owns. I learned to hold a fork again, to shower without leaning on the tiles, to breathe without feeling my ribs splinter. But when the nurses checked on me, I remained quiet, small, obedient. People forget the meek, and I needed the world to forget me just long enough. Because on paper, I was dead. A charred body with just enough resemblance had been tagged as mine. The dental records matched records I hadn't updated in 15 years. A clerical error, a rushed identification, and a daughter who didn't ask a single clarifying question. Grief makes people thorough. Convenience makes them careless. Candace chose convenience. While I was learning to lift a spoon again, she was hosting a celebration of life brunch instead of a funeral. No casket, no vigil, no folded hands or trembling voice. Just a country club slideshow and a credit card statement full of catered pastries. Not one recent photo of me. I'm sure only the old ones where I still looked useful. 2 days after the crash, she listed my house. Not her childhood home. Not the place where she lost her first tooth or learned to bake brownies with too much salt. No, a charming vintage property with great potential. She highlighted square footage, not memories. She staged the living room where I used to hold her during storms. She photographed the backyard where she planted daffodils at age 6, grinning with her hands covered in mud. To her, it was a fixer-upper. To me, it was a life she was bulldozing for profit. I heard from a nurse unintentionally that Candace had shown no hesitation signing probate papers. She wanted my accounts transferred immediately. She called my home a burden she needed to unload. She wanted closure, though what she meant was cash. The airline's settlement letter arrived while I was still sleeping on a rented hospital bed in the rehab facility. The envelope shook in my hands when I opened it. Not from excitement, this wasn't a gift. It was a bribe. $18 million. All for my silence. No interviews. No lawsuits. No truth. I read the number twice, then again, and felt absolutely nothing. Not joy, not greed, just an eerie calm. The amount wasn't the revelation. The revelation was this. Both my daughter and the airline wanted me gone. Neither would get what they wanted. I called Marvin, the only person who'd ever asked how I was without needing a check afterward. I expected him to gasp when he heard my voice, maybe even cry. Instead, he went silent in the way people do when their world tilts for a moment. "June, where are you?" "Alive," I replied. More than I can say for my reputation. We met in a borrowed office 2 days later. I wore sunglasses and a scarf, not out of shame, but to shield myself from the strangeness of being among the living again. Marvin didn't hug me. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. "I want the settlement," I told him. "But I want control. Complete." He nodded. "And I want Candace nowhere near it, not a dollar." He didn't blink. We drafted the early framework for Bree's trust that day, though I didn't finalize it yet. Bree, sweet girl with the crooked smile, had never asked me for anything except time. Candace had demanded everything except love. 3 days later, I checked myself out of rehab, took a cab to a small town 3 hours away where no one knew my name. I rented a modest 2-room apartment under June Emerson, my grandmother's maiden name. The air there was quiet, unhurried. I bought a used car, shoes without laces, and a dark coat that made me feel like someone with nothing to lose. Because in a way, I didn't. The first time I went back to my house, it didn't feel like mine. Hydrangeas I'd planted after Walter died were gone, ripped out, and replaced with cheap stone chips. The front door was now a fashionable beige, cold, and forgettable. Even the wind chime Bree made in second grade was missing. A plastic sign in the yard read, "Under contract." I parked behind a delivery van, watching a young couple touring the place. The man pointed to the roof. The woman laughed, already placing imaginary furniture in rooms where my life once lived. And behind them, like a shadow that didn't belong to me anymore, stood Candace in a white blazer, charming and calculated. She looked like a realtor. She did not look like a daughter in mourning. Later in my apartment, I opened the untraceable laptop Marvin gave me. Inside were emails forwarded from the estate attorney, messages Candace thought no one but him would ever read again. She'd already sent photos of my furniture for appraisal. She wrote to a mover, "The old stuff can go. Donate or dump." The cedar chest my mother gave me on my wedding day was labeled trash. The quilt she sewed me by hand? Too shabby for resale. Candace wasn't simply removing my belongings. She was erasing me. 3 days later, I went back not to confront her, not yet, but to witness. I watched her and Bree from a cafe window. Bree looked tired, arms crossed, quieter than I remembered. Candace gestured aggressively while talking, a rhythmic pattern I knew well, the one she used when she wanted to turn blame into persuasion. They drove to a storage facility. I followed at a distance. Candace cataloged boxes on a clipboard. Bree just looked, resigned, and inside one of the boxes, I saw it, a ceramic horse figurine Walter gave me on our 5th anniversary. It toppled sideways when Candace tilted the box, then vanished behind packing paper. She didn't even look. After they left, I walked behind the building to the dumpster. Among trash and broken wood lay a photo frame, the glass cracked straight through Walter's face. Our wedding picture, the only copy I had. I lifted it with both hands, cradling it like a wounded thing. Rage didn't come. Something colder did. She wasn't getting rid of clutter. She was discarding history, our history. That night, holding the fractured photo on my lap, I called Marvin. "She sold everything," I told him. "Even my memory." He didn't try to comfort me. He just asked, "What do you want to do?" I stared at the crack across Walter's smile. "I want a front row seat," I whispered, "to everything she built on my grave." And when the moment came, I wanted Candace to see me not as a ghost, not as a mother she could ignore, but as the woman she tried to erase who refused to stay buried. Justice wasn't loud. It was patient, and I had patience to spare. Marvin used to tell me that the law moves slower than grief. At the time, I thought he meant deadlines and paperwork. Now I understood it meant something colder. The law notices truth long after people stop pretending. And Candace, my daughter, my inheritor, my eraser, had been pretending for so long she didn't realize the ground beneath her was shifting. While she filed petitions with the confidence of someone already spending the inheritance, Marvin quietly carved delays into the system, not denials, not accusations, just strategic pauses. "Pending verification," he would note. "Awaiting documentation." He never said the words out loud, but we both understood. We were buying time for the truth to grow teeth. Meanwhile, Candace was flourishing in her own mythology. She opened a new office downtown, a glass and gold space that reflected more ambition than sincerity. She rebranded herself as a lifestyle curator, whatever that meant. In carefully crafted posts, she wrote about resilience, reinvention, rising from tragedy. My tragedy. She was living louder in my absence than she ever did in my presence. And yet, every weekend, she summoned Bree to help packing, sorting, staging. I knew the pattern. Use the girl's gentleness as labor, then claim her compliance as loyalty. Bree always folded herself into small spaces beside her mother, trying not to disrupt the delicate ecosystem of Candace's self-importance. But Bree wasn't Candace. Her silence wasn't agreement. It was survival. The first time I followed Bree, it wasn't planned. She left the office alone one afternoon, headphones in, steps soft, as if she didn't want to disturb the sidewalk. Something about the slope of her shoulders made me trail behind her at a distance. She stopped at a bookstore, a small independent shop with crooked shelves and handwritten signs. When she crossed the threshold, she changed. Her guard slipped, her posture eased. She drifted toward the fiction section, like she was returning to an old friend. Then she sat on the floor, legs folded under her, reading as if the world couldn't reach her there. And for a moment, I saw the child she used to be, the one who'd fall asleep on my rug mid-chapter, head tipped sideways against the couch, dreams tangled with sentences she didn't finish. My throat tightened. Grief isn't always about losing what you loved. Sometimes it's about recognizing what you never should have lost in the first place. I left before she had the chance to look up and see me. Not because I didn't want her to, but because I wasn't ready to be seen by the one person whose gaze still mattered. That night, back in my apartment, I made a list. Not of possessions, not of grievances, of truths. It was number 7 that caught me. Grief reveals character, but so does omission. Candace forgot that love for children, for parents, echoes longer than bank accounts. She forgot that Bree felt deeply, even when she said little. And in that unasked question, "Are you okay?" I saw the fracture line where everything would eventually split, not through anger, through love. 3 weeks later, when I finally walked into Candace's office uninvited, I wasn't shaking. I wasn't even angry. I was simply steady. She looked at me like she was seeing a ghost she didn't believe in, and when I placed that formal notification on her desk, stating I was alive and controlling every cent she hoped to inherit, her face cracked in ways my bones had during the crash. I left her there, breath caught between disbelief and dread. I didn't need to shout. She understood. People who build their lives on foundations of assumption don't expect the ground to wake up beneath them. The following days were quiet. Too quiet. Then Marvin called. She emailed. He said, one word in the subject, clarification. I didn't ask what the body said. I already knew. Candace only speaks in 2 languages, convenience and control. If something doesn't fit into those categories, she reframes it until it does. But the world was no longer bending for her. That night, I walked beside the river. Rehabilitation had taught me to move slowly, to let my feet relearn trust. The water's reflection trembled with each step I took. Grief, betrayal, relief, they all looked different in ripples. I thought of Walter, how I buried him in a suit we couldn't afford, how I held our daughter afterward while she whispered, "It's okay, Mommy, I'm here." And I realized something unbearably human. Children don't remain who they start as, and parents don't either. The next morning, I went to the bank. I'd like to open a trust, I told the clerk. For my granddaughter, Brianna Claire Mallow. Her eyebrows lifted not at the amount, but at the certainty in my voice. I read each clause with the precision of someone who had been misjudged for decades. Bri wouldn't touch a cent until she was 25. She wouldn't receive anything if Candace controlled her finances. She would have to sign it in person, fully aware, fully independent, not punishment, protection. When it was done, I walked out lighter, not because wealth had changed hands, but because the future had been redirected towards someone who still remembered how to hold tenderness without weaponizing it. For the first time since the crash, I slept a full night without waking from imaginary alarms. Justice wasn't coming. It was already in motion. Candace always believed she could control the story by saying it loudly enough. But Bree, quiet, observant, soft in the way steel can be soft before it hardens, was never built for the kind of narrative her mother curated. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she acted, which meant she noticed cracks long before they became fractures. When Candace posted that polished photo on her business page, chin tilted, blazer immaculate, captioned with "New Beginnings," stronger than before, I stared at her eyes. They didn't look strong. They looked trapped. Like a woman who'd built a stage set, she could no longer leave without the audience noticing she was hollow behind the curtain. The next morning, an email arrived. Subject, "Is it really you?" I read it 3 times. "Grandma, Mom says you're not well. She says you're confused and unstable. But I heard you came by her office. And I think I saw you a few weeks ago near the bookstore. If it was you, I just want to say I'm glad. I hope you're okay. Love, Bree." It was the first time since the crash that a sentence landed inside me warmly instead of like shrapnel. I wrote back, "Yes, it was me, and I'm well enough to know the truth now. Thank you for seeing me even when no one else did. Meet me. Just you." Her reply came fast. "Tell me where and when." Just 5 words. Enough to stitch something back together. We chose the cafe with the lemon tarts she used to devour as a child. Tuesdays at 4 p.m. The quiet hour between the rush and the lull. Bree was already sitting by the window when I walked in. She wasn't anxious, just waiting. A kind of waiting that didn't feel like obligation. She stood when she saw me, her eyes widening not with shock, but with recognition as though she had already accepted my survival the moment she first suspected it. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," I echoed. The hug was a little stiff at first. Trauma makes even love hesitate. But she didn't let go too quickly. And neither did I. We sat. A server took our orders. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Yet the silence didn't ache. It breathed. "You look different," she finally said. "I am," I answered. "I figured." She pushed the lemon tart around its plate, not eating yet, just thinking the way she always had, slowly, deliberately. "I didn't know," she whispered. "After the crash, I thought maybe they made a mistake. But Mom said everything was confirmed. She told people she identified your body." "She didn't," I said calmly. Bree nodded once, jaw tight. Not surprised, just disappointed in a way that still carried love somewhere beneath the hurt. "She sold everything," Bree murmured. "The house, your things. She said you would have wanted her to start fresh. I never believed that." "Do you believe her now?" I asked. "No." A single syllable, firm and clear. There it was, the fracture line becoming a choice. The server placed the coffee in front of me. Bree picked up her fork, then set it down again. "So why now?" she asked. "Because I needed to know if I still had family left." Her eyes softened, the way eyes do when recognition reaches deeper than blood. "You do," she whispered. For the first time since I woke up in that hospital, something in me unclenched. I told her about the trust, the conditions, the timeline, the protections built not as shackles but as guardrails. She didn't flinch at any of it. "You don't receive anything while your mother controls your finances," I said. "Nothing until you're 25. And only after a meeting with Marvin." She nodded. "That's fair. There is no punishment in this," I added. "Only choice. And if I don't want it, you walk away." She breathed out a long, quiet exhale that felt like freedom. "Why me?" she asked softly. "Why give me anything at all?" "Because when I was gone," I said, "you were the only one who noticed." Her eyes filled bright, sudden, but she blinked the tears back. Pride, disguised as composure. "I missed you," she said. "So much. But Mom made it hard." "I know. She'll be furious that I'm here." "I'm counting on it," I said. And it made her laugh, an actual laugh, short and surprised, like a memory resurfacing. We ate our lemon tart the way we always had. Me stealing the sweetest part, her pretending to be annoyed. Some rituals don't die, even when people think you did. Before she left, Bree reached across the table and took my hand. "You came back," she whispered. "I never left," I said. And this time, when we hugged, there was no stiffness at all, only recognition, reunion, and the quiet rebuilding of something Candace had never understood. Love doesn't disappear just because someone else wants it to. Candace never understood that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It waits, it listens, and when the right moment comes, it steps forward quietly, like a witness emerging from the shadows. I didn't need to confront her publicly. She was already unraveling in places she didn't know anyone was watching. Marvin called first. "She's meeting with another attorney," he said. "Someone she trusts enough to speak carelessly around." "Let her," I replied. Carelessness is honesty without its makeup on. I wasn't wrong. 2 days later, I sat at the far edge of a patio downtown, half hidden by a fern plant and oversized sunglasses. Candace arrived in a white tailored coat, her armor. Across from her sat Deborah Lang, a woman I remembered from Candace's high school years. Fast-talking, ambitious, hungry for the kind of life that always seemed slightly out of her reach. The server poured wine. Candace didn't wait for it to breathe. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Deborah asked. "I waited a year," Candace said, swirling the glass like she could intimidate the Chardonnay into agreeing with her. "She can't just show up again and take back everything I built." "She's your mother," Deborah reminded her gently. Candace's laugh wasn't gentle at all. "She was my mother. Then she disappeared. Now she's a disruption." There was no tremor in her voice, no flicker of doubt, just the solid, practiced confidence of someone who had rehearsed her narrative until she believed it more than the truth. "You don't get to vanish for a year," she continued, "and expect the world to stay exactly where you left it." I watched her wipe condensation from her wine glass with a folded napkin, always tidy, always controlled. She had weaponized poise. She thought it made her untouchable. Deborah leaned in, voice lowered. "And Bree?" What if she sides with her? Candace shrugged. Bree is sentimental. It's her flaw. I told her to stay away. And if she doesn't, then she'll learn the hard way that money and loyalty don't mix. For a moment, the sounds of the patio blurred, silverware clinking, a distant siren, a burst of laughter from another table. My heart didn't break. That had happened months ago. Now, something colder crystallized inside me, sharp as ice and just as clear. Deborah took a sip of her drink, hesitating. If June sues— Oh, she won't, Candace interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. She's unstable, fragile. I'll challenge competency. No judge wants a mess involving an elderly woman presumed dead for a year. Deborah went quiet. Candace pressed on. And if she tries to be generous, some grand gesture, a trust or something, I'll make sure people see it for what it is. Instability. Emotional manipulation. That's harsh, Candace. No, she said. It's practical. Hearing it wasn't painful. It was confirmation, solid, irrefutable. She wasn't unsure. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was preparing to destroy me a second time, but with paperwork and witnesses instead of silence. I stood. Not out of anger, but because the performance was over. I didn't need an encore. I walked away without looking back, letting her voice fade behind me like static from a station I no longer listened to. Back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter Marvin had prepared weeks earlier, my insurance, my boundary, my final line. But I didn't open it. Not yet. I had something more important to do first. I wrote a note to Bri. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Walk with me. Bring your questions. I'll bring the truth. She arrived early, hands in her sweatshirt pockets, hair pulled into a lazy bun, eyes clear in that way people's eyes are when they've already made a hard decision before you even approach. We walked a full minute without speaking, the morning fog curling around our ankles like something alive. I saw her, I finally said, talking to a lawyer, planning her move. Bree didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. What did she say? Her voice was quiet, but firm. That I'm a disruption, I replied. That she'll challenge my competency. That she'll twist whatever I do into something unstable. Bree flinched, not from shock, but recognition. She doesn't want you back, she murmured. Not the real you. She wants the version she can manage. The truth landed gently but deeply. She ever manage you? I asked. A small, humorless laugh escaped her. Every day. We reached a bench. I sat. Bri joined me, elbows on her knees. I used to think staying quiet was being loyal, she said slowly. Now I think it's the reason she gets away with everything. Silence is permission, I said. She nodded. I'm going to move out, she added abruptly. A friend needs a roommate. It's small, nothing fancy, but it'll be mine. I took her hand, felt the tremor she tried to hide. I'm proud of you. Her eyes shimmered. She didn't look away. She's going to try to hurt you, Bree whispered. Legally, publicly, however she can. She'll fail, I said simply. Not because I'm stronger. Because she's already written her own ending. The breeze sighed through the trees. Somewhere, a child laughed. A dog barked. The world moved on, unbothered by the unraveling of a mother and daughter nearby. Do you ever miss her? Bree asked. Who she used to be. I answered honestly. I miss the version of her that didn't have to win. We sat in silence, a good silence, a rebuilding silence. And in that quiet I realized, this wasn't about revenge. Candace was undoing herself just fine. All I had to do was stand still long enough for her to see the ruins she built with her own hands. I didn't want her destruction. I wanted her recognition and her reckoning. The fall had already begun. All that remained was watching the dust settle. The second time I walked into Candace's office, I didn't wait for permission. I didn't schedule a meeting. I didn't soften myself for anyone's comfort. The receptionist's startled, stammering face barely registered. I passed her, like someone returning to a crime scene, not to mourn, but to take notes. Candace's office door was half closed. I pushed it open. She was pacing, phone pressed to her ear, a tight line carved between her brows. When she saw me, she froze mid-sentence. The silence was sharp. I'll call you back, she snapped, ending the call before the other person could protest. June, she breathed, as if the syllable itself were an accusation. Candace. Her arms crossed her shield, her barrier, her denial. I said nothing. I wanted her to fill the silence, to trip on her own performance. You can't just walk in here, she began. I can, I said, and the truth of it unsettled her more than any threat could. You're not well, she tried again. I'm better than I've been in years. Her eyes flickered toward the hallway, as if searching for an audience to validate her version of events. There wasn't one. What do you want? She asked. I've already taken what I want, I replied. I'm just here for the silence that comes after. She scoffed. You think you're righteous? You abandoned everything, you disappeared, you left me to clean up the wreckage. You mean the house you staged, I said. The money you assumed. The life you rearranged while I was hooked to machines. I thought you were dead, she shouted. You didn't check, I said softly. That silenced her. For a moment, just a breath, I saw the little girl she used to be flicker behind her eyes. Then the adult version shoved it back down. I was surviving, she whispered. No, I corrected. You were erasing. Her jaw trembled, but she steadied it. She'd always been good at performing stability on top of chaos. I came today, I said. Not to fight, not even to punish. I came to see what? She asked. To see whether there was anything left of my daughter inside you. She opened her mouth and said nothing. You raised a smart girl, I added. And she made a smarter choice. You gave her everything, Candace whispered. No, I said. I gave her space. You gave her conditions. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was final. What happens now? She asked, the bravado draining from her voice. I leave, I said. And you stay and live with what you did. I turned to go. Wait, she called after me, voice small. Do you hate me? I paused, hand on the door. No, I said. That would mean I still expected something. I closed the door quietly, the way you close a book you realize you'll never open again. The office Marvin chose for our final meeting wasn't glamorous. It was tucked above a bakery that always smelled like warm sugar and burnt edges. The furniture was mismatched. The coffee was old. But it suited the moment. Quiet, unassuming, honest. June, he said simply when I walked in. Let's begin. We reviewed the documents slowly, methodically. The trust irrevocable upon my signature. The foundation for women like me. Women who had been forgotten in the gaps of life and family. The ones no one checked on. The assets transferred away from greed's reach. The estate placed where legacy could grow, not rot. And Candace? Marvin asked gently. She receives nothing, I said. Not name, not memory, not scent. He didn't question it. We moved on to medical directives. Bree appointed as proxy when ready. Marvin until then. No ceremony at death, no speeches, no curated grief. Write this exactly, I instructed. Let the quiet speak for her. When everything was signed, Marvin sat back. I've known you a long time, he said, but I've never seen you this clear. I was waiting, I replied, for the noise to stop. Outside, the wind carried the smell of bread and cold air. For the first time since the crash, I felt like my feet were touching the ground I chose, not the ground others pushed me into. Candace received the final letter on a Thursday. It wasn't dramatic. No threats, no accusations, just a page of legal clarity. Every claim she assumed was void. Every inheritance she expected was gone. Every plan she built on my grave had evaporated, irrevocably, cleanly, completely. The last line was the softest. No further correspondence is required. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I didn't need to. People feel the truth even when they try to bury it, especially then. I returned to my old street one last time, not to reclaim anything, to remember without grief. The house looked smaller, not worse, just occupied by a life that wasn't mine. A woman stepped onto the porch, calling for her child. A toddler ran out, all wild hair and mismatched socks. Their laughter spilled into the air like sunlight. I saw Candace at 3 running through sprinklers. I saw her at 16 screaming that I made everything harder. Both memories lived in the grass. I didn't look away. I placed an old photo me, Walter, little Candace, under the mailbox with a stone. Not a message. Just truth. I existed here, and I no longer need to prove it. The wind chimes on the porch were new. Their sound was lighter than the ones Bri made for me years ago. Still, they played me out. Bri let herself into my apartment just before noon, announcing, "It's just me," the way she used to when she was 10. We ate sandwiches and potato salad at my small kitchen table, 2 plates, mismatched glasses, no performance. We talked about her art history class, about the internship she wanted in Portland, about choosing a life, rather than inheriting one. You're moving forward, I told her. Not away. Her eyes softened. Will you miss me? She asked. Every day, I said. She smiled a little shaky, a little full. Good. We tended to the herbs on my patio afterward. She watered them carefully, correcting my lazy neglect. When she finished, she sat on the ground beside the pots and sighed. I think healing, I said, watching her, is telling the truth over and over until it stops hurting. Even if no one believes it? She asked. Especially then. Before leaving, she hugged me hard, not politely, but with the kind of embrace that anchors you to the world. You changed everything, she whispered. No, I said. I just stopped pretending. She nodded, wiped her cheek, and walked out into the soft afternoon light. I didn't cry. Not because I lacked feeling, but because for the first time my heart was full enough that pain had nowhere else to settle.